Welcome to Tevora's webinar, Introduction to ISO 27001. My name is Matt Fullerton, and I'm an account manager here at Tevora. But today we're going to be hearing from John Huckabee, our Managing Director of Cybersecurity and Compliance. If there are any questions, please use the question function in GoToWebinar, and we will address those at the end of the call. But first, a little background on Tevora. We are a management consultancy focused entirely on information security, compliance, and enterprise risk management. We're a full-service security partner that can help with just about any compliance framework, like the ISO 27000 series, SOC 1 through 3, PCI, HIPAA, HITRUST, and more. We also perform security assessments and penetration tests, and we can even help with product selection and implementation. We've been in business going on about 17 years, and we work with companies of all sizes, all the way from startups and garages to Fortune 500s. So that's a little bit on who we are here at Tevora. John, why don't you take it away?
Hello, everyone. This is John Huckabee. As Matt mentioned, let's go ahead and get started here. Welcome to Tevora's introduction to ISO 27001 and keys to a successful ISO 27001 certification. We're going to just do a brief high-level overview of ISO 27001, then we'll jump into framework components and the structure. We'll talk a little bit about typical ISO certification timelines, what you can expect to see in your organization. We'll also address keys to successful certification. So what are those attributes of successful year one certifications? And then we'll talk a little bit about what Tevora has to offer as a ISO 27001 consulting practice. So let's go ahead. As Matt mentioned, Tevora is a ISO lead auditor firm. We've helped hundreds of organizations attain certification across all verticals. And of course, we're a comprehensive security consulting services firm. I've been in this business for 17 years now. So hopefully I can share some of my experience with all of you, and it'll be helpful to you going forward. So just a high-level overview of the ISO 27001 standard. It's actually pretty much the oldest standard out there when it goes to information security, where you can get certified under. So it was originally written in 1995 by the UK government. So it has European origins, and then it was published by BSI, an organization also based in the UK. So with operations global, of course. It's the most widely recognized international information security certification and standard. For those of us in North America, we're used to a lot of the frameworks, AICPA SOC, or maybe it's a PCI data security standard, and on and on. There are several North American-based frameworks, HITRUST in the healthcare world. A lot of those frameworks actually leveraged ISO because ISO is the original standard by which all their standards somewhat leverage some of the same concepts. So when you're thinking of kind of the original standard and where it originated from, it was really this ISO 27001 concept as it relates to information security. The standard is organized into 10 standard clauses, and we'll go through those on the next slide, in 14 control categories. So there's a pretty straightforward structure that we'll review in future slides here. I wanted to mention up front this concept of the ISMS because it's relatively specific to ISO 27001, and that is the Information Security Management System. And just a high-level definition, it's a framework of policies and procedures to achieve information security objectives. One attribute of ISO 27001 is it's a 3-year certification cycle. So you get certified in year 1, and years 2 and year 3, you perform certain ISO required activities, such as the internal audit, the risk assessment, and of course the surveillance audit by your external auditor. But the full certification is only once every 3 years. So although there are required activities in years 2 and 3. I mentioned that There's an annual risk assessment and internal audit that's required. Again, it's the most recognized international information security certification. So let's get to some of the details within the structure. There are 10 clauses within the standard. Those first three that I put in parentheses concept there, those are just informative clauses that aren't customized to each of the environments that are getting certified. So there's the scope clause, the normative references clause, the terms and definitions clause. Those are serially more informational and conceptual, and again, are not areas that your organization would customize to fit your environment. However, those remaining 7 clauses, context of the organization, leadership, planning, support, operation, performance evaluation, and improvement, those are addressed by your ISMS and are customized to your environment and to how you're achieving your security objectives. So let's go to the next slide and just provide a high-level backdrop on what each of those clauses represent. So clause 4, context of the organization. It's really just understanding the organization and its context, internal and external issues to the information security environment, the scope of your certification, and of course, interested parties. So what parties are interested, both external and internal, with your organization's information security. Clause 5, leadership. It's really the communication, promotion, the establishment, the resources, how you're tackling each of those topics from a leadership perspective. Clause 6, planning, risk assessment, risk treatment, objectives, and plans to achieve. So how is your organization going about planning for the information security of the environment? Clause 7, support. How are you supporting the information security environment with resources, with competency, with awareness, communication, document controls, etc. Clause 8, operations. The main focus of this clause is really performing risk assessments and having mechanisms for risk treatment. Clause 9, performance evaluation, and that's of course not individual performance, but how are you evaluating the performance of your ISMS or your information systems management system? Clause 10, an improvement. How are you improving your ISMS moving forward? How are you improving the information security environment? Are you addressing non-conformities and corrective actions? Are you correctly addressing those and following up on those? So at a high level, those are the 7 clauses that you'll need to address to be certified. And when your external auditor comes to your organization, these are the clauses that they will be, or the topics that they will be drilling down on to understand how your organization is addressing information security. We could probably spend all day talking about these clauses. I didn't want to make this webinar about these topics, but at a high level, I just wanted to introduce the concepts. So another important component of the standard is what is known as the Annex A controls. And really, there's a lot of confusion with folks that are new to the 27001 standard. There's this concept of the clauses, which I just introduced, but there's also this Annex A of controls that is a little bit different conceptually. And probably, frankly, if you're a security and compliance professional, you're probably used to, kind of checklist auditing where there's a series of controls, and when you're becoming compliant with the standard or framework, you just kind of go down the list and make sure that you've implemented the controls and those are operating effectively. Of course, with the ISO concept of clauses, it's just a different approach, I think, to information security that's somewhat unique. So it's important to understand the relationship between the control categories, which are presented on this slide, and the clauses that I previously presented. Think of them as being integrated. So to support those ISO clauses, your organization needs to implement controls. And these controls are suggested in the Annex A from the standard. So think of these controls as supporting the clauses. However, when your external auditor comes to evaluate your certification, they will be evaluating the clauses and further downstream, essentially the controls. But really, it's the clauses and the concepts within the clauses that the external auditor will be most concerned with. So think of these controls again as a mechanism to support the clauses, but not necessarily, they are not the standard. This is an annex of the standard that is used to support the concepts within the clauses. So a little bit tricky, somewhat conceptual, and different than other compliance standards that you may be used to. So wanted to just spend a little bit of time addressing that relationship between the controls and the clauses. But it's worth mentioning the clauses are not optional. You need to meet the objectives of all of the clauses. The controls, however, and which controls you choose should be customized to your environment. Think of these not necessarily as recommendations, but as guidance, if you will. So these 14 categories, and again, if you're familiar with information security concepts, you're going to recognize a lot of these. And that's because other standards you may be familiar with actually leverage these categories from the ISO standard. They are information security policies, the organization of information security, human resources security, asset management, access control, cryptography, physical and environmental security, operation security, communication security, system acquisition, development, and maintenance, supplier relationships, incident management, business continuity, and compliance requirements. So those are the 14 categories of controls that are supplied in the Annex A. It's also worth mentioning that ISO 27002 is a standard that actually elaborates on these controls within the control category. So if you want even more detail and support and guidance, you can leverage the ISO 27002 standard. So that's a little bit about how the framework is structured with the clauses and the Annex A controls. Now I want to get into what a typical ISO engagement timeline would look like. So here you've got this kind of initial phase, which we call the gap analysis. If you look at this very bottom row here, we have this particular organization working on their gap analysis in January and February. So what's entailed in the gap analysis? We collect documentation, we conduct interviews, we analyze the information and the feedback that is given during those interviews and the document collection, and then we provide the results. That's typically a month to 2 month process. Then we kind of go into ISO control treatment. Think of that as the designing of controls or the implementation of controls. Here we have a time span of March to May, 3 months. That time span can vary. Typically, the larger the organization, the larger it takes to implement the controls and address those. We've seen some organizations that are relatively mature, address their gaps within a month because they don't have many gaps, and the gaps that they do have are pretty straightforward. Other organizations may take as long as a year, just depending on, again, it's depending on the complexity. Because ISO is an international standard, you're often dealing with organizations across multiple countries. So, that type of coordinated effort obviously takes time. So again, that ISO control treatment time frame can vary quite a bit. Once an organization has established those controls, then you can begin really putting paper to pen in terms of documenting your ISMS. Again, that's that collection of policies and standards you use to govern your information security environment. There are also another key artifact within the ISO realm is the SOA, or the Statement of Applicability. It's a required document that will be required by your external auditor. And it's really straightforward. It basically outlines which clauses and controls are applicable to your environment. Of course, that's something that the external auditor would need to certify your environment. And then there's this concept that I previously mentioned of the risk assessment and the internal audit. These are two very distinct required activities and deliverables for certification. So when your external auditor comes in for that stage 1 audit, and for the stage 2 audit, they're going to want to see that a risk assessment and internal audit was performed. So just understand that there's a formal requirement for an annual risk assessment and also for an internal audit. And we'll talk a little bit more about those in future slides here. This last phase, and again, this timeline depicts August through September. That is kind of the ISO certification through a third-party ISO certifying body. There's the stage 1 audit, which is typically about a month to 2 months prior to the stage 2 audit. And the stage 1 audit, really the external auditor just wants to make sure everything is ready for the stage 2 audit. Do you have your statement of applicability? Do you have your ISMS established? Have you conducted your internal audit, your risk assessment, et cetera, et cetera? It's really kind of just kicking the tires to begin the certification process. Now, the stage 2 process, think of that as the real external audit to certify your organization. That's where the third-party certifying body will perform a real audit and really dive into the details of how you're meeting those objectives in those clauses that we outlined earlier. This is the typical time frame, typically 2 to 3 months for your external audit to perform stage 1 and stage 2 and then issue the certification. Yeah, so that's the timeline again here. We depict a 9-month timeline overall. I would say on average, our year 1 clients seeking certification are in that 9 to 12 month period. It can go shorter, it can go faster, depending on the maturity and the in-house resources. So this is just a timeline, kind of a sample timeline to give you an idea of how the ISO 27001 roadmap to certification looks like. So again, here's the concept, the same concepts, but depicted a little bit differently that I wanted to share with you. The gap assessment, the remediation, the internal audit, the risk assessment, the certification for audit support. These are all services that Tevora provides. And most of our clients year 1 will task us with supporting them with all 5 of these phases. So again, I just wanted to kind of depict it differently for you and provide a little bit more language on the slide to give you a little bit more context. So I wanted to give a little bit more information on the internal audit and the risk assessment. The internal audit and the risk assessment are required annually, as previously mentioned. The internal audit should be performed by a certified ISO lead auditor. So what is a certified ISO lead auditor? Well, if you go on the internet and you Google ISO lead auditor, you'll find a number of organizations that can provide training to certify you as a lead auditor. So BSI is the most prominent one. So if there is one that the most popular one out there is BSI, but certainly there are other organizations performing that training. We're not suggesting one over the other, but BSI is the most prominent. And remember, BSI was the original author of or publisher of the standard. The risk assessment, however, does not need to be performed by a lead auditor. And there are a couple of different approaches that you can use for the risk assessment. The ISO has a risk assessment framework that is often followed and meshes well with the ISO 27001 certification process, but certainly here in North America, NIST is very prominent as well. And so I would say in Europe, we actually see most of the risk assessments being ISO based. And here in North America, a larger percentage are definitely NIST based. So those are the two most prominent. There are a series of other risk assessment frameworks out there. Again, it's really just up to you to choose what standard or framework best assesses the risk within your organization. But I just wanted to give a couple of examples of the two most prominent ones. You're going to want to complete the internal audit and the risk assessment a couple of months prior to your stage 1 audit or surveillance audit. That is, if you uncover any significant issues, you'll have a little bit of time to address those and to get remediation or corrective actions in place to address whatever you found in that internal audit. And then in the case of risk assessments, you'll be able to establish risk treatments or mitigation strategies prior to that stage 1 or stage 2 audit. So again, just a little bit of reiteration there on the timing of the internal audit and the risk assessment. Oftentimes the internal audit and risk assessment are performed in parallel, but that's not required. But again, you do want to complete both of those with plenty of time to spare prior to your stage 1 audit. And in years 2 and 3, when there are surveillance audits, you want to perform those activities prior, of course, to the surveillance audits. Lastly, document corrective actions and risk treatments. Your external auditor and in general, the expectation for the ISO 27001 standard is that you're identifying corrective actions and you're identifying nonconformities and you're identifying correlating corrective actions to address those nonconformities. Likewise, for risk that were identified in your risk assessment, you'll want to document your risk treatment. So that's just a little bit more on internal audit and the risk assessment. Again, two very distinct requirements in the ISO 27001 standard that you'll need to meet. So let's get to keys to a successful certification. As I mentioned earlier, we've supported hundreds of clients in their efforts with ISO 27001. The first thing is use an experienced assessor firm. There are a lot of boutique shops out there that may say they have ISO 27001 experience, but we run into it all the time. You know, somebody knows somebody who knows somebody, so they use a person that maybe is not affiliated with a firm, and they say that they know the standard because they downloaded the standard and read it once. You need, you need a little bit more support than that to navigate this successfully. We've seen it time and time again where organizations tried to save money and kind of avoided the firms to prepare them, but all it really did was delay their certification and cause some rework. So our very first recommendation here is to use an experienced assessor firm. Next, use a firm that effectively supports remediation. ISO has a lot of very prescriptive requirements. I laid out a lot of that for you here today with respect to the clauses, with respect to the supporting controls, the internal audit, the risk assessment. There are a lot of details and nuances that go into preparing for the standard and what your external certifying body will expect to see. So using a firm to support that remediation and putting the right documentation in place, implementing the right controls, evaluating those controls is of paramount importance. Not all firms effectively support remediation. So make sure that when you're talking to firms, you're addressing the remediation part of it because it's really the most critical part of the engagement. Next, I mentioned earlier, you want to leverage the Annex A and 27002 controls to support those ISO clauses. Pretty straightforward guidance. Both are publicly available, so you can go ahead and just go through those 14 control categories and drill down on those again. those concepts should be relatively familiar to you if you're an experienced information security and compliance professional. Get executive buy-in. ISO is not for the faint of heart. It's a 3-year certification cycle. It's substantial capital investment. You know, there are a lot of reasons why you're going to want executive buy-in. It has been a pitfall of some of the organizations that we've seen where some of the folks within information security wanted to get ISO certified, but they didn't have the right executive buy-in. So they started down the path, but weren't able to complete the journey because they just simply didn't have the support that they needed. So our advice is, before you start down the path to certification, make sure that you've got the right buy-in with your organizations, and that usually starts at the top. And then lastly, use Tevora, and we're going to talk a little bit about some of the tools and support that Tevora brings to the table as a ISO lead auditor firm. First and foremost, we provide things like policy templates, so statement of applicability, ISMS examples, control documentation, risk assessments, business continuity and disaster recovery plans, et cetera, et cetera. There are a number of key artifacts that we provide that really support that remediation effort, and that we really enjoy as a firm actively supporting organizations in achieving each of those subparts of the standard. Again, experience, as I mentioned, Tevora has been doing this since 2006. We really value relationships here at Tevora. We take a lot of pride in our client retention rate, and basically the reputation that we've built in the community. That means a lot to us, and I think if you were to speak to any of the organizations that work with Tevora, they would echo those sentiments. Again, customer satisfaction and quality. Our approach and methodology, and even mantra as a firm, is to provide the best customer satisfaction in the industry. Executive oversight and engagement management. For every one of our ISO clients, you will have managing director oversight. So someone with 15, 20 years of experience. We don't shoot out junior auditors to our clients and have them run with it. We've found through years of experience and observations that just doesn't work. You really need executive support throughout the engagement to ensure the engagement success. So that's something that we do. You know, it might make our price tag a little bit higher, but we know that it ensures success and helps us build relationships. So that's why we take that approach. I mentioned strategic remediation. I also think Tevora does a great job of executive summary. So providing presentations, documents, collateral that really communicate to upper management, executives, even the board of directors, on what ISO 27001 is and where your organization is at in the journey and what the next steps are. I think we really have some great materials and supporting deliverables around that. And then lastly, as a comprehensive security consultancy firm, one of the things that we provide that a lot of our competitors don't is we're a solution provider. So we resell information security tools and software, appliances, et cetera. And we also have implementation teams. So things like Splunk, you can buy Splunk through Tevora, and you can also have Tevora consultants implement Splunk. That sort of integration and comprehensive information security services is not common in the industry. Certainly, there's only a handful of firms in the country that have that comprehensive approach. We think that that's part of why our clients love us and have continued to use us over the years. So that's just a little bit about Tevora's value proposition. And that brings us to our last slide. There's a picture of me. If you have any questions, please reach out to Matt Fullerton here. He's the gentleman that opened up the conversation at the beginning of this presentation. And he can provide you with a copy of this deck, so you can use it as a reference. And if you have any questions, just filter those to Matt, and we'd be more than happy to answer those, both right now. We'll address some questions that you might have, as well as going forward if your organization is considering high trust down the road. So Matt, what questions do we have from the audience?
Yeah, thanks, John. I think we're a little bit over on time, but
okay.
Just real quick here.
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about how to scope your ISMS? Like, why would an organization choose to just limit it to one business unit instead of their whole organization?
It's a good question. There's a lot of factors that go into the scope of the ISMS. Really, ISO in particular has this concept of inputs and outputs. So what are the inputs into your business processes, and what are the outputs to your business processes, and how do you ensure that those outputs are what they need to be? So that conceptually, if you're thinking of your organization's outputs and ensuring the security of those outputs, that's one way of thinking about it. And certainly, if you go through ISO lead auditor training, there's a lot of emphasis on that input and output concept, which is further elaborated on something known as the turtle diagram. Not to digress too much, but the ISMS, it can be completely customizable, but you want to tackle something that's achievable as well. So, typically our advice is, what do your business partners that want to know that you're certified, what would they most want to see secure, or what processes, what IT environment systems would they want to know are secure? And that's basically where we start. And then the second question is, how achievable is it? Should we just limit this to your headquarters? Should we expand the scope to all business units? Those are all questions that are tackled on a case-by-case basis, and there's certainly no one-size-fits-all. So I would say, first, one piece of advice is focus on, well, what would your business partners want to secure, or in-house, internally, what would you want to secure, to reduce liability and some of the other business objectives you may have. And then secondly, what is achievable? I think that keeping those two objectives in mind when defining the scope of your ISMS, that's a good start. Good question.
Great. Thank you, John.
Yep. All right. Thanks for your questions. As I mentioned, we're out of time here, but feel free to filter any ongoing requests to Matt Fullerton, and please consider Tevora for any ISO 27001 consulting services in the future. Thanks, everyone.